You might imagine the final days of Julius Caesar as a swift drama of daggers, whispers, and sudden treachery. Yet to understand why anyone in Rome considered raising a hand against a man of such sweeping ability, you need to step back from the famous images and settle into the steady, ordinary movements that shaped his world long before the knives appeared beneath the white folds of a senatorial robe. The story begins with Rome itself, not yet an empire, but something far more complicated and fragile. A republic stretched thin across distant lands, crowded with ambition, fear, and the quiet rhythms of daily survival. If you were walking the streets of Rome in the decades before Caesar's rise, you would find a city swollen beyond its capacity. Narrow lanes wound between apartment buildings stacked so high and so precariously that some leaned into each other like weary neighbors. Vendors called out from stalls, selling figs, bread, salted fish, or whatever they could spare from the countryside shipments that arrived irregularly. The Tiber River carried silt and refuse downstream, and the docks were filled with murmurs about grain prices, political rumors, and the endless news carried from the faraway provinces. Rome was supposed to be governed by its citizens, but the citizens were divided by wealth, geography, and age-old patronage networks. The city was filled with people who were not citizens at all, and even among those who were, only certain classes could vote on certain matters. The Republic worked, but only in the sense that a cart with one broken wheel still rolls if pushed hard enough, and Rome was pushing hard. Behind the scenes, families of great influence managed alliances and feuds that stretched decades or even centuries. These families controlled courts, public festivals, temples, and the selection of magistrates. The system valued tradition, and because of that, change came slowly, even when circumstances demanded urgency. As Rome expanded into new territories, old rules struggled to contain new problems. Soldiers stationed far from the city often returned home to find their farms seized or ruined, while wealthy landowners absorbed more fields into vast estates, worked by enslaved laborers. The result was a swelling class of displaced veterans who relied on political patrons for survival. Caesar emerged from this world, shaped by its tensions long before he influenced them. He was born into a patrician family whose prestige had faded, and because of that, he learned early how to navigate both advantage and limitation. He walked through the same crowded streets, heard the same grumblings about grain and land, and understood the slow erosion of the republican balance. His rise was not sudden. It was the product of careful alliances, charm, debts, and an unusual ability to speak directly to people whom other nobles ignored. By the time Caesar gained prominence, Rome was already divided among influential figures whose names echoed through the Forum. Men like Pompey the Great, celebrated for military victories, and Crassus, known for wealth so vast that it defied easy measurement, shaped political life through a mixture of public generosity and strategic pressure. Caesar recognized that none of them could dominate Rome alone, because the Republic was built on dispersing power across many offices and councils. But he also realized that if these powerful men cooperated, even loosely, they could bend the system. This realization led to an informal alliance, sometimes called the First Triumvirate, though no official document named it as such. Caesar brought political skill and popular appeal, Pompey offered military prestige, and Crassus contributed financial strength and access to influential networks. Together they worked around Senate opposition, passing measures that favored their interests. For ordinary Romans, these changes felt almost procedural, just another set of laws added to a long list. The peaceful appearance of daily life masked the growing imbalance beneath. Still, even as Caesar prepared to leave Rome for a long military command in Gaul, he understood how fragile this cooperation really was. Rome's politics were held together by personal trust, rather than institutions. When that trust faltered, alliances collapsed, and families turned on each other. For Caesar, the decade he spent campaigning in Gaul would change not only his own fortunes, but the entire fabric of Roman life. As he marched north to the lands that stretched beyond the Alps, the city he left behind struggled with familiar problems. Crowds demanded grain distributions, and magistrates tried to maintain order in a city that could erupt with little warning. The Senate debated issues that seemed both vast and trivial, from military funding to new construction projects. The People's Assembly met regularly, their votes influenced by rhetoric, patronage, and the practical concerns of poor citizens who cared more about stable prices than about distant wars. Out in the provinces, Caesar built loyalty among his soldiers with consistent pay, shared hardship, and promises of land for their families. His army became not just a military force but a community shaped by long marches, temporary fortifications, and evenings gathered around campfires where officers shared stories of Rome's shifting politics. The soldiers understood that their general had ambitions, but they trusted him because he shared their dangers. Each winter, while the cold rains swept across the Gallic territories, Caesar wrote detailed commentaries on his campaigns, sending them back to Rome. These writings served two purposes. They informed the public and simultaneously shaped his own reputation. As his victories accumulated, Caesar became increasingly popular among those who appreciated decisive leadership. Yet his growing influence also fueled concerns among senators who believed the Republic could not survive under the shadow of one man. Some feared that Caesar's wealth, accumulated through spoils of war, would allow him to dominate elections upon his return. Others worried that his loyal army might follow him into the city. Yet while they debated, the rhythms of Roman life continued. Bread was baked, markets opened and closed, and workers repaired aqueducts without thinking of political upheaval. Over the years, the triumvirate dissolved. Crassus died during a campaign in the east. Tensions grew between Caesar and Pompey, the latter now aligned with senators who viewed Caesar as a threat to Roman stability. When Caesar's term in Gaul neared its end, the Senate made a demand that would become a turning point. He must dismiss his army before returning to Rome. The logic behind this was clear. A Roman general could not legally bring soldiers into the city, and without his troops, Caesar would be vulnerable to prosecution from political enemies. For Caesar, this was unacceptable, not because he sought power for its own sake at that moment, but because he knew the consequences of political defeat. Trials in Rome were rarely fair, especially when fueled by personal grudges. He also believed that his achievements earned him certain rights and protections, so rather than surrender his position, he made a decision that set the Republic on a path toward irreversible change. He ordered his troops to march south, crossing the small river known as the Rubicon. This single action broke the customs protecting Roman political order, and it forced every citizen to choose sides. The civil war that followed was not a sudden storm, but a long series of movements, negotiations, and unexpected outcomes. Caesar pursued Pompey across the Mediterranean world, eventually defeating him. Many senators fled, or reluctantly accepted Caesar's new leadership. Slowly, and often without fanfare, Rome adjusted to the reality that one man now held far more authority than any republican system could contain. Caesar introduced reforms intended to stabilize the state, addressing grain supply issues, correcting calendar problems, and planning new settlements for veterans who had become a restless presence in Roman society. And yet, these initiatives did not calm everyone. Among a group of senators, the fear grew that Rome was losing its identity. They believed the Republic could not survive under the weight of Caesar's popularity, his wealth, and the loyalty of his soldiers. Even as he accepted honors and titles, Caesar insisted he was repairing the state, not destroying it. But in the quiet conversations occurring in shaded courtyards and private dining rooms, some senators concluded that the only way to restore balance was to remove the man they saw as the root of the imbalance. It is here, in these slow-moving tensions and unhurried political calculations, that the story of his assassination begins, not with flaring anger or sudden betrayal, but with ordinary fear, the daily pressure of political life, and the sense that something essential in the Roman order had begun to slip beyond reach. As you consider the Rome that shaped these decisions, you might wonder what thoughts were forming in the minds of those senators who walked the forum each morning, feeling both the weight of tradition and the presence of a leader whose power no longer fit within the old structures. What quiet doubts did they nurse as they watched Caesar accept new honors, and how did they justify the idea that one act might restore centuries of balance? When you picture the day Julius Caesar was assassinated, it is tempting to imagine a moment of sudden violence, knives flashing in sunlight, and the roar of betrayal echoing through the Senate House. But before that fatal scene unfolded, there existed a far longer, quieter process, one that stretched across months and years, played out in whispered conversations, carefully measured gestures, and the slow accumulation of fear and resentment. The conspirators were not heroes nor villains in the modern sense. They were citizens operating within a system they believed must be preserved. Understanding their mindset requires tracing the subtle pressures, frustrations and anxieties that shaped their decisions. After Caesar crossed the Rubicon and established himself as the dominant force in Rome, he worked diligently to consolidate power. He restructured the calendar, revising the outdated Roman system to better align with the solar year, ensuring that festivals, agricultural cycles, and civic ceremonies would proceed with greater predictability. He increased grain distributions, carefully maintaining the fragile loyalty of urban populations who might otherwise grow restless. He enacted land settlements for veterans, hoping to stabilize the countryside while rewarding the men whose loyalty had carried him through civil war. These were, in many respects, practical reforms, but they carried a hidden danger. They made him indispensable, and indispensability in Rome had always been a source of fear. In the Forum and the quieter corridors of the Senate, senators watched his every move. Some were impressed by his efficiency and foresight. Others were disturbed by the clarity with which he could bend events to his will. They remembered the old days, when magistrates and consuls took turns leading, when decisions were argued, delayed and diluted through multiple voices. Caesar's ability to achieve results with speed and precision created a sense of imbalance. To them, the Republic felt fragile, as though it might shatter under the weight of one man's authority. The worry was not abstract, it had practical consequences for their own lives, fortunes and families. Among the senators who would eventually conspire against him, fear mingled with resentment. Some were concerned that their voices would no longer carry weight. Others worried that Caesar's public appearances, speeches and generosity were slowly transforming the citizenry into a body incapable of independent judgment. The Republic was, in essence, a balance of competing interests, and Caesar's ascendance tilted that balance dangerously. The conspirators did not necessarily see themselves as murderers. In their minds they were restoring equilibrium, preventing the collapse of an age-old system that had guided Rome through wars, famine, and internal unrest for centuries. These men operated in shadows, planning slowly and cautiously. Unlike the dramatic images that dominate textbooks, their meetings took place in private homes, under the guise of friendship or casual political discussion. They measured Caesar's routines, noting the hours he spent in the Senate, the paths he took through the city, the friends he kept close, and the distant relatives who might influence him. The planning was patient, almost methodical, and every detail mattered. In Rome, information was power, and those who wielded it quietly often had the greatest effect. One of the key conspirators, Gaius Cassius Longinus, exemplified this patient approach. Cassius had been a soldier and statesman, well versed in both military strategy and the art of political persuasion. He understood Caesar's achievements, and perhaps even admired them, but he was equally aware of the danger posed by a single man holding ultimate control. He and other senators such as Marcus Junius Brutus began to recruit colleagues quietly, appealing to shared memories of past Republican values, to family loyalties, and to the notion of honor. Their argument was simple yet profound. The Republic must survive, even if it means removing a man who had become its most capable steward. Meanwhile, Caesar maintained a careful awareness of potential threats. Though he did not recognize the full extent of the conspiracy, he was aware of rivalries and complaints, but he had long navigated Rome's political currents with skill. His confidence was rooted in both his military achievements and his deep understanding of human psychology. He relied on charm, generosity, and spectacle to maintain influence. He hosted lavish dinners, presented gifts, and rewarded loyalty with offices and titles. These actions, however, were double-edged. They strengthened devotion among some while deepening resentment among others, who saw such favors as attempts to buy influence or bypass the traditions of governance. The final weeks before the Ides of March were filled with ordinary, almost mundane activities that masked the deadly purpose taking shape. Caesar received petitions, oversaw the distribution of funds, listened to legal disputes, and attended religious ceremonies. He may have felt secure in his role, believing that his popularity among the people and his loyal army made him untouchable. Yet the conspirators moved silently, scheduling meetings, refining arguments, and ensuring that those who had doubts would be convinced that the act they were planning was both necessary and inevitable. The atmosphere in Rome during this period was one of subtle tension rather than open conflict. Citizens continued to conduct their daily routines, often oblivious to the maneuvering at the highest levels of government. Merchants sold wares in the Forum, laborers repaired roads, and soldiers returned from distant provinces. Yet in the back rooms of senatorial houses, discussions grew increasingly focused on a single question: how could one man's death restore order without plunging the city into chaos? The conspirators wrestled with the moral implications of their plan, with practical concerns about timing, and with the potential for unintended consequences. They debated which senators to involve, how many guards might be present in the Senate House, and how to ensure that Caesar's supporters would be unable to retaliate immediately. Ironically, the conspirators' caution reflected an understanding that Caesar's skill lay not only in military command but also in perception. He had long mastered the art of reading a crowd, whether on a battlefield, in the Forum, or during a ceremonial procession. To strike successfully, they had to overcome not only his physical presence, but the psychological influence he exercised over those around him. Every detail mattered: where he would be seated, the number of attendants nearby, and the angle from which a dagger could be delivered without obstruction. The planning process resembled a slow-motion battle, not of armies, but of minds. Even among the conspirators themselves, uncertainty persisted. Marcus Brutus, whose family had long connections to Rome's republican ideals, hesitated. He admired Caesar personally and understood the general's achievements. He feared the consequences of assassination and the stain it might leave on his own reputation. Yet he was persuaded that extraordinary measures were required to protect the Republic. In a way, Brutus's inner conflict reflected the broader tension of the period, a mixture of admiration, fear, and moral calculation that cannot be reduced to simple motives. The senators were acting out of duty, personal concern, and a deep-rooted desire to maintain the structures that had governed Rome for centuries. In parallel, Rome itself continued its indifferent rhythms. Daily life seemed almost untouched by the political undercurrents. Children played in streets, farmers brought fresh produce to market, and citizens debated matters of minor legislation with the same casual attention they always had. This contrast between ordinary existence and high-stakes political maneuvering underscores the subtlety of historical change. Great events do not always arrive with dramatic fanfare. Often they unfold quietly, within networks of relationships, trust, and fear. And so, as the Ides of March approached, both Caesar and the conspirators were moving inexorably toward a collision, each influenced by complex histories, personal experiences, and the slow accumulation of political momentum. The senators believed they were preserving something essential, while Caesar, confident in his achievements and his following, likely underestimated the extent of the threat. In the calm and quiet of ordinary Roman life, the final act of a story that had been decades in the making was taking shape. The tension between fear, loyalty, and principle raises a lingering question. When a system feels threatened, at what point does the preservation of tradition justify extreme action? And if the very people who were meant to defend the Republic believed assassination was the only solution, what does that say about the fragility of political institutions? In the next section, you will witness the culmination of these pressures, the act that would echo through history, and the immediate chaotic aftermath that changed Rome forever. The morning of March 15th in 79 BC, later immortalized as the Ides of March, arrived with an ordinary quiet that betrayed nothing of the extraordinary event about to unfold. For most Romans, it was simply another day. Citizens went to the forum, merchants arranged their wares, priests conducted rituals, and soldiers maintained their posts. Yet in the Senate House, tension had reached a peak, measured not by loud voices or visible turmoil, but by the silent awareness of what was planned. The conspirators, 30 or more men bound together by cautious deliberation and shared anxiety, had chosen this moment with care. Their target, Julius Caesar, moved through familiar routines, unaware of the danger lurking among his closest colleagues. The Senate House itself was a modest structure, unassuming in appearance, yet weighted with centuries of decisions, debates, and power struggles. Its wooden furniture and marble floors had witnessed countless votes, ceremonies, and arguments, and it was here that the conspirators gathered, mingling with the ordinary senators, maintaining an air of casual business. They spoke in low tones, referenced procedural matters, and behaved as though nothing was amiss. Every glance, every gesture, was calculated to avoid raising suspicion. In a sense, the mundane details of the setting, the creaking floorboards, the scent of wax candles, the hushed conversations, were as crucial as the knives hidden beneath togas. Caesar arrived later than usual, accompanied by his attendants and guards. He entered with the confidence of a man accustomed to attention, noting the arrangement of senators and the subtle greetings exchanged in the chamber. For a moment the assembly resembled a standard session, debates about minor bills, formal announcements, and the occasional joke or polite remark. Yet behind the veneer of normalcy, the conspirators positioned themselves strategically. Some approached as though to consult him on matters of protocol. Others lingered in places where their presence would seem natural. Each detail, rehearsed in thought and whispered planning, was now enacted in reality. The first strike came suddenly, yet it was almost imperceptible if you were not paying close attention. One senator leaned closer to Caesar, ostensibly to engage in conversation, and a dagger slipped into the folds of his robe. The motion was swift but practiced, intended to inflict maximum effect while maintaining coordination among the group. Within moments, the room became a scene of frantic movement. The ordinary atmosphere shattered, Shouts of shock echoed against the marble. Senators tried to intervene, and attendants sought to shield their leader. Caesar, taken by surprise, attempted to retreat, but was overwhelmed by the proximity and number of his attackers. Historical accounts describe him covering his head with his toga, a gesture of instinctive defense rather than theatrical posturing. Others note that he struggled, that he called out, and that his expression revealed both recognition and disbelief. The room was a mixture of violence and confusion, a scene that contrasts sharply with the careful, deliberate planning that had preceded it. In the midst of the chaos, the conspirators maintained their purpose, striking repeatedly, each blow aimed at ensuring the end of a single life, and, in their view, the salvation of an entire system. When it was over, Caesar lay dead. The Senate House, once a space of deliberation, had become a silent testament to centuries of accumulated tension. The assassins, breathing heavily and aware of the enormity of their act, began to disperse into the streets, leaving behind a scene that would soon become legendary. For the ordinary Roman citizen, the news arrived slowly. Traders and laborers noticed changes in traffic and unusual gatherings, then heard rumors of the violence, and finally learned that the man who had dominated the city and its territories for years had been killed. The shock rippled outward, moving from the Senate House to neighborhoods, markets, and temples, where citizens struggled to comprehend the implications. The immediate aftermath was chaotic in ways both expected and unexpected. Contrary to the conspirators' hopes, the city did not immediately rally behind the idea of restoring the Republic. Instead, public sentiment fractured. Citizens loyal to Caesar mourned him, some even violently. Political opportunists seized the moment to advance their own agendas. The very structures the conspirators sought to protect, the assembly, the magistrates, the legal system, experienced turbulence and indecision. Rome's streets, so often the site of ordinary routines, became stages for shouting, gathering, and fear, illustrating the difficulty of controlling outcomes even when intentions are clear. In the weeks following, the surviving senators attempted to justify their actions through speeches, proclamations, and appeals to tradition. They claimed the murder had been necessary to preserve liberty, to prevent tyranny, and to maintain Rome's centuries-old governance. Yet history reveals that such arguments were insufficient to stabilize the state. Caesar's followers, including allies who had survived the civil wars and veterans loyal to him, began to mobilize. Factions emerged, alliances shifted, and what the conspirators had imagined as the restoration of order became the spark for yet another civil war. The assassination, in this sense, was both an ending and a beginning, a violent punctuation in a story that continued to unfold over decades. It is instructive to consider why the event has endured in memory, not because it was a dramatic display of cruelty, or because Caesar's life was singularly remarkable, but because it highlights the interplay between human ambition, fear, and the fragility of political systems. Ordinary men and women, performing daily tasks, were drawn into consequences that they could not have anticipated. Veterans, merchants, farmers, and citizens experienced ripple effects that shaped their lives, whether through economic disruption, forced military service, or shifting social norms. The assassination reminds us that history is often not shaped by single acts alone, but by the accumulation of decisions, the patient cultivation of relationships, and the unforeseen consequences that flow from ordinary circumstances. In the long term, Caesar's death did not restore the Republic as the conspirators had intended. Instead, it accelerated its transformation into the imperial system we now associate with Rome. Augustus, Caesar's heir in political skill and familial connection, would eventually consolidate authority in a way that made the structures of the Republic largely ceremonial. Yet even in this transformation, the lessons of the Ides of March persisted. Power concentrated in a single individual can unsettle centuries of established order, fear can motivate extreme acts, and careful planning can never entirely predict the chaos that human societies generate. For the modern observer, the story of Caesar's assassination is a meditation on the interplay of ambition and caution, of public perception and private calculation, and of the subtle tensions that exist in every society between order and disruption. It is a reminder that even in the quietest days, history is being written, often by actions that seem ordinary at the moment, yet whose consequences extend far beyond any one person's life. And so, as you consider the Ides of March, the image is not only one of daggers and betrayal, but also of a city moving through ordinary routines, a population caught between loyalty and fear, and a network of individuals making decisions that ripple through time. The story concludes with both resolution and reflection. Julius Caesar is gone, but Rome endures, reshaped by ambition, calculation, and the unforeseen consequences of human action. What remains is a question that has echoed for centuries. Can any society preserve balance when the forces of loyalty, fear, and ambition converge in a single decisive moment? To imagine a Roman legion camp is to step into a world of structure, routine, and the quiet rhythms of survival. Unlike the dramatic battles that fill textbooks, the majority of a soldier's life was spent in repetition, digging ditches, constructing fortifications, and marching from one unfamiliar location to another. The camp was not merely a temporary shelter, it was a microcosm of Roman organization, a place where law, discipline, and human endurance were exercised daily. Life within the camp illuminates the ordinary experiences that underpinned Rome's extraordinary military success. You might arrive at dawn, when mist still clings to the earth, and observe soldiers moving through narrow paths between tents. Each tent was meticulously arranged according to rank, duty, and unit, forming a grid that mirrored the order expected on the battlefield. Centurions inspected the rows, ensuring that standards were maintained and that no soldier lingered idle. The attention to detail may have seemed excessive to outsiders, but within the legion, precision was survival. A poorly dug trench or a misaligned tent could mean chaos in the event of an attack, or worse, illness spreading through overcrowded quarters. The daily routine began early. Soldiers performed physical exercises designed to maintain strength, agility, and endurance. Equipment was cleaned and repaired, from gladius swords to pilum spears and protective shields. Armor was polished, not for vanity, but to prevent rust and ensure functionality. Even the most menial tasks were executed with care, reflecting the Roman understanding that preparation and repetition formed the backbone of effective combat. There was no theatrical flourish in these activities. The value lay in consistency, in turning repetitive effort into reliable performance under unpredictable conditions. Beyond the physical labor, life in the camp involved a quiet hierarchy of social organization. Soldiers were assigned specific duties beyond fighting. Some baked bread in small ovens, others tended to livestock, and a select few recorded inventories or handled correspondence. These roles, though unglamorous, were essential to the functioning of the legion. The camp operated almost as a self-contained city, with kitchens, workshops, and medical facilities, all arranged according to a careful plan that allowed hundreds, sometimes thousands of men to live in proximity without descending into disorder. Observation of this organization reveals a Roman principle repeated across centuries, that meticulous attention to mundane details often determined the difference between success and failure. Meals were a particular focus of routine. Soldiers consumed rations designed for endurance, hard biscuits known as buccellatum, salted pork, legumes, and occasionally wine diluted with water. Food was functional rather than pleasurable, and its preparation followed strict schedules. In quieter moments, men would sit together in small groups, exchanging stories or quietly reflecting on home, family, and past campaigns. These conversations, though easily overlooked, helped maintain morale, creating small bonds of loyalty and familiarity that reinforced the cohesion of the unit. In many ways, the camp was as much a social experiment as it was a military installation. Discipline was maintained through a combination of authority, routine, and public example. Centurions wielded the power to impose corporal punishment for infractions ranging from tardiness to failure to maintain equipment properly. Yet this discipline was never arbitrary. It existed to ensure that when the legion faced combat, every man would act predictably and effectively. The stakes were high. Missteps could cost lives not only of individuals but of entire cohorts. Soldiers internalized the rules because they understood the logic behind them, not merely because they feared authority. In this sense, the camp functioned as both school and society, shaping men into reliable instruments of Roman military power. Evenings were quiet, dominated by reflection, repair of personal items, and occasional small fires around which soldiers gathered. Letters from home when they arrived were cherished but rare. Personal belongings were minimal, often limited to practical necessities and a few keepsakes. Sleep occurred in shifts, especially during campaigns, and soldiers quickly learned to rest lightly, aware that danger could arrive at any moment. The mundane routines of washing, mending, and preparing for the next day formed a rhythm as precise as the beating of a drum, shaping a sense of order amid uncertainty. Occasionally, the camp would experience a moment of ceremony or ritual. Soldiers might participate in religious observances, offer sacrifices for protection, or mark the promotion of a fellow soldier. These events provided brief interruptions in the relentless march of routine, creating small focal points for communal life. Even in these moments, the purpose was pragmatic. Rituals reinforced loyalty, strengthened morale, and offered a controlled release for emotions that might otherwise disrupt the cohesion of the unit. Such seemingly minor details contributed to the long-term resilience of Rome's military machine. Beyond the walls of the camp, life in the surrounding territories was closely monitored. Scouts and foragers were sent into nearby lands, observing local conditions, acquiring food, and reporting any signs of danger. These excursions were dangerous but essential, requiring the same careful planning and attention to detail that governed life inside the camp. The legion's success depended not only on battlefield prowess, but on the quiet work of intelligence, supply management, and observation, often conducted far from the attention of historians who later focused on triumphs and conquests. Interestingly, the daily life of the camp also shaped the broader culture of Rome. Soldiers returning from long campaigns brought with them knowledge of distant lands, local practices, and technologies. They introduced these ideas slowly into Roman society, influencing architecture, agriculture, and commerce. The empire's expansion was not merely a product of conquest but of the cumulative experience of ordinary soldiers performing repetitive, disciplined work over many years. Each march, each fortification, each ration prepared and distributed, contributed to a larger system whose effects extended far beyond the battlefield. The quiet endurance of life in a legion camp illuminates a deeper truth about history. The extraordinary achievements of empires often rest upon ordinary sustained effort. While historians focus on victories, political maneuvers, and prominent leaders, the hidden labor of daily life, the repetitive digging of trenches, the careful inspection of equipment, and the slow cultivation of loyalty among men, forms the foundation of what later generations call greatness. In this sense, the legion camp is not merely a military institution, but a lens through which we can understand resilience, order, and human adaptation. As the legion moved from one province to another, these routines continued, adapting to terrain, climate, and local conditions. Winter campaigns required insulation and careful rationing. Marches through unfamiliar territory demanded reconnaissance and adjustment to new dangers. Soldiers endured discomfort, risk, and uncertainty, yet the rhythm of daily tasks provided a sense of stability amid unpredictability. In this quiet, methodical life, one can trace the roots of Rome's enduring strength, a civilization built not only on spectacular battles or charismatic leaders, but on the patient, persistent work of ordinary people operating within structured systems. And yet, even in this carefully maintained order, uncertainties persisted. Disease, weather, local resistance, and human error could disrupt plans. Soldiers might face death not on the battlefield, but from simple mistakes or miscalculations in the camp. Each day, while appearing mundane, carried the potential for crisis. The legion's success depended on foresight, attention to detail, and a disciplined approach to ordinary tasks, lessons that extend beyond the Roman context and illuminate the nature of organized human effort across time. As you consider the quiet life of a Roman soldier in a legion camp, you might wonder how many of history's most powerful outcomes were shaped not by brilliant strategy or inspiring speeches, but by patient adherence to routine, unremarkable labor, and the steady application of discipline. What might the history of the empire have looked like if the mundane work of these camps had faltered, even for a brief period? In the next section, we will follow these legions into campaigns, exploring how the careful structure of daily life intersected with the chaos of war, and how ordinary soldiers shaped the fate of an empire. By the time a Roman legion left the carefully arranged safety of its camp, the men were trained, disciplined, and conditioned to endure long periods of monotony, interspersed with sudden bursts of extreme effort. These soldiers, having lived through the repeated routines of digging, polishing armor, repairing tents, and managing supplies, were prepared to march hundreds of miles through unfamiliar terrain, often under conditions that would test the limits of human endurance. The transition from camp life to campaign life was gradual, almost imperceptible, yet it revealed how the ordinary tasks within the camp had formed the foundation for extraordinary military achievement. The march itself was slow and methodical. Soldiers carried weapons, packs, and essential provisions, often totaling over 60 pounds. Centurions led their centuries in tight formations, ensuring that the columns maintained order and cohesion, even when the terrain became rough or uneven. Scouts and cavalry advanced ahead to survey paths and check for ambushes, while engineers considered how to bridge rivers, level hillsides, or construct temporary fortifications along the route. Each movement was deliberate, the product of careful planning and an understanding that success depended on coordination as much as courage. Food and water remained a constant concern. The legion relied on a mixture of pre-supplied rations, locally acquired resources, and, when necessary, foraging. Foraging was particularly delicate. Soldiers needed to acquire sustenance without provoking hostility from local populations or exhausting the surrounding land. Even small failures could produce widespread suffering within the ranks. Discipline and routine skills honed in the camp were vital in maintaining this balance, allowing soldiers to adapt to changing circumstances while minimizing the chaos that could arise from scarcity. Encounters with local populations introduced another layer of complexity. Roman soldiers were not merely fighting machines. They were representatives of an expanding empire, often moving through territories with distinct cultures, customs, and economies. They observed local agricultural methods, trade patterns, and social structures. Sometimes they would purchase food or hire guides. Other times they would impose requisitions as part of the logistical system. These interactions, though generally mundane, shaped the Roman approach to governance and occupation, producing a slow cultural integration that was as significant as any military victory. Evenings during marches followed a recognizable rhythm. Soldiers set up temporary camps, often marked by a standard layout inherited from the permanent legion camps. Trenches were dug for defense, sentries posted, and fires arranged for cooking and warmth. Officers conducted inspections, ensuring that equipment remained functional and that discipline was maintained. Amid these routines, soldiers shared stories, wrote letters when possible, and tended to minor injuries. The consistency of these rituals provided stability in otherwise unpredictable conditions, reminding the men that the order cultivated in the camp could be carried into the chaos of movement and uncertainty. The actual engagements with enemy forces were brief compared to the time spent marching and preparing. Battles were dangerous, but they represented a small fraction of the legion's overall experience. Success depended not only on the individual skill of soldiers, but on their ability to execute coordinated maneuvers, learned through repetition and strict adherence to orders. The dense formations, disciplined shield walls, and coordinated attacks that historians later praise were built upon months and years of tedious practice. Without the groundwork laid in camp routines, the legion's strength in battle would have been far less reliable. Casualties, disease, and fatigue were constant companions. Soldiers learned to treat wounds, ration their strength, and endure the physical and psychological strains of prolonged campaigns. Engineers constructed temporary roads and bridges to facilitate movement, often laboring under harsh weather and constant oversight. Medics and assistants cared for the sick and wounded, relying on limited knowledge of anatomy and herbal remedies. The survival of the legion depended on the meticulous execution of these seemingly minor tasks, illustrating that ordinary diligence and careful planning were just as important as bravery in the outcome of military operations. During extended campaigns, soldiers also contributed to Roman infrastructure. They built fortifications, repaired roads, and established supply depots, leaving permanent marks on the landscape that outlasted their campaigns. These activities served multiple purposes: practical defense, logistical support, and a demonstration of Roman presence to local populations. Again, the significance lies not in dramatic confrontation, but in the patient, repetitive work that allowed the empire to maintain and expand its influence. Each bridge completed, or road repaired, was a quiet testament to the uncelebrated labor behind Rome's power. The slow accumulation of experience in both camp and campaign created a distinct culture among the legions. Soldiers shared a sense of resilience, trust, and loyalty, forged in shared hardships and daily routines. Hierarchies were respected, traditions maintained, and rituals followed not out of blind obedience, but because they reinforced order and collective survival. The ordinary details, cleaning armor, distributing rations, performing sentry duty, formed the invisible threads, holding the massive structure of the Roman military together. In effect, Rome's dominance was not only the result of leaders like Caesar or Augustus, but of countless individuals who performed unremarkable yet vital tasks with precision. Despite the structure and discipline, uncertainty was a constant. Weather could delay marches, disease could spread rapidly through ranks, and unexpected resistance could turn routine movements into crises. Leaders had to adapt, improvising with the information at hand while maintaining order among thousands of men. The ability to manage ordinary details under extraordinary stress was central to Roman success, revealing how resilience in small daily practices could influence outcomes on a much larger scale. These campaigns also provided soldiers with insights into the broader world. They observed different governance systems, agricultural techniques, and local crafts, gradually accumulating knowledge that would inform Roman administration. Over time, the integration of conquered territories relied not only on force but on understanding, adaptation, and patient observation. In this way, the quiet work of marching, foraging, and maintaining discipline directly shaped the empire's expansion, underscoring the often overlooked connection between routine labor and historical outcomes. The life of a Roman soldier, dominated by repetition and quiet endurance, demonstrates that history is rarely composed of spectacular moments alone. Rather, it is built on the accumulation of small, consistent actions executed over time. The legion's effectiveness arose from these unglamorous details: precise drills, careful maintenance of equipment, orderly distribution of rations, and patient adaptation to environmental and social conditions. These actions were far removed from heroism in the dramatic sense, yet they were essential to Rome's enduring influence across continents. As you reflect on the slow, structured life of a legion in motion, consider how ordinary persistence shapes extraordinary results. How much of the empire's expansion depended not on battles alone, but on the quiet, relentless execution of daily tasks that ensured survival, discipline, and cohesion. And if the men who carried the weight of Rome had faltered, even for a brief moment, how different might the course of history have been? Now we will witness the culmination of these campaigns, exploring how ordinary discipline intersected with monumental events, and the subtle, lasting effects that legionary life had on both soldiers and the empire itself. As the campaigns of the Roman legions progressed, it became clear that conquest was not the result of brilliant tactics alone. The empire's expansion relied on countless small, unglamorous decisions executed with precision, discipline, and persistence. Soldiers returning from distant provinces carried more than spoils of war. They brought knowledge, habits, and networks that gradually transformed conquered regions into extensions of Roman life. The mundane work of a legion marching, digging, repairing, maintaining equipment had implications far beyond the battlefield, shaping governance, infrastructure, and culture in subtle but lasting ways. During extended campaigns, soldiers were often tasked with the construction of fortifications, bridges, and roads. Each effort, while tedious and physically demanding, served a strategic purpose. A fortified encampment provided security against ambush, a well-constructed bridge allowed the rapid movement of troops, and a road connected isolated regions to the heart of the empire. These projects were planned with remarkable precision, reflecting lessons learned in the camps and applied to unpredictable environments. Soldiers moved and labored in routines that minimized mistakes and ensured survival, demonstrating the importance of ordinary diligence in extraordinary circumstances. Local populations frequently observed these activities. Villagers and townspeople, initially wary or even hostile, gradually adapted to the presence of Roman legions. They witnessed methods of construction, systems of supply, and rules of order that were unfamiliar but effective. In some cases, locals were employed to assist with labor, gaining skills that would be absorbed into the Roman administrative framework. Through patient repetition of basic tasks, digging, transporting materials, supervising work, the legion transformed not only landscapes, but also societies, laying foundations for roads, towns, and trade networks that persisted long after the soldiers moved on. Even in the midst of hardship, such as harsh winters, rain-soaked marches, or extended sieges, the routines of the legion persisted. Soldiers maintained equipment, tended to their small plots of cultivated land near encampments, and performed minor repairs on armor and weapons. This persistence reinforced both individual resilience and collective cohesion. A soldier who had spent weeks repairing a single section of road or reinforcing a palisade understood, in a direct and immediate way, that careful attention to ordinary duties was inseparable from survival. In many respects, the quiet labor of these men, performed under discipline and oversight, underpinned the very idea of Roman order. Campaigns also served as a medium of cultural exchange. Soldiers observed local customs, agricultural practices, and architectural techniques. Some of these insights were carried back to Rome, influencing construction methods, culinary practices, and administrative approaches. The slow absorption of foreign practices was a subtle but significant form of imperial governance. Ordinary routines, repeated over time, produced cumulative effects that extended far beyond the immediate military objectives. In this way, the quiet, repetitive labor of soldiers shaped the empire in ways that dramatic battles alone could not. As Rome's borders extended, the human cost of campaigns remained high. Disease, exhaustion, and the occasional miscalculation claimed lives and tested endurance. Yet the culture of discipline, honed through repeated practice in camps and marches, allowed legions to endure challenges that might have overwhelmed less organized forces. Soldiers learned to anticipate problems, improvise solutions within structured routines, and support one another in ways that reinforced loyalty and reliability. The ordinary daily practices, preparing rations, performing sentry duty, maintaining equipment, became instruments of resilience, shaping both individual and collective capacity to survive and prevail. In moments of relative calm, soldiers reflected on the cumulative impact of their labor. Fortifications built, roads cleared, bridges constructed, and territories surveyed all contributed to the slow consolidation of Roman authority. These tasks, often unremarkable to those outside the legion, were vital to the empire's ability to maintain control over vast and diverse lands. The repetition and precision cultivated within the legion camp translated directly into the capacity to govern, integrate, and administer territories that might otherwise have resisted domination. Rome's success was as much about these measured, steady efforts as it was about decisive engagements with enemy forces. Returning soldiers, veterans who had experienced the intersection of routine and extreme stress, brought back more than stories of conquest. They introduced order into cities, towns, and rural estates. They applied practical knowledge of logistics, construction, and governance, and they carried lessons about the endurance and patience necessary for success in complex systems. In this way, the ordinary experiences of individuals reverberated through the empire, producing effects far larger than any single campaign could achieve. The quiet, disciplined work of these men became an invisible thread binding the empire together. The slow, repetitive tasks of legionary life also highlight a broader truth about history. Extraordinary outcomes often rely on ordinary processes executed reliably over time. Rome's expansion was possible because soldiers, conscripted or volunteer, lived lives dominated by routine, attention to detail, and shared responsibility. Their labor, uncelebrated yet indispensable, sustained campaigns, stabilized territories, and facilitated cultural integration. Without this foundation, even the most brilliant generals would have found their achievements fleeting. As you reflect on the life of a Roman soldier, it becomes clear that history is often shaped not only by dramatic victories or famous leaders, but by patient adherence to routine, discipline, and order. Ordinary men performing ordinary tasks, day after day, created the conditions for extraordinary outcomes. The legion's quiet, sustained labor underscores the hidden weight of empire, the subtle, unglamorous work that allowed Rome to endure across centuries. And so, the story concludes with both a sense of accomplishment and reflection. The Roman Empire was built not merely by conquest or ambition, but by the persistent, disciplined efforts of its soldiers. In the quiet repetition of daily life, digging, marching, repairing, observing, Rome's power was secured, and the ordinary became the foundation of the extraordinary. Perhaps the lesson for us today is the enduring value of diligence, patience, and the unseen labor that shapes history far more than we often acknowledge. If you picture medieval London, you might imagine a bustling city of merchants, narrow streets, and stone buildings overlooking the Thames. Yet beneath the surface of this familiar image lies a story of ordinary struggle, quiet adaptation, and the slow accumulation of knowledge about a river that could sustain life as easily as it could destroy it. For centuries, the people of London lived in a delicate balance with the Thames, a relationship defined by its tides, seasonal floods, and the constant threat of waterborne disruption. Daily life along the river involved careful observation. Farmers, fishermen, and traders who lived in the low-lying neighborhoods developed routines dictated by the ebb and flow of water. The city's docks were narrow, and wooden jetties required frequent repair. Small boats were essential for transport, and their maintenance was a constant task. Men and women learned to recognize subtle changes in water color, debris patterns, and the wind's direction, all of which signaled potential flood risk. These practices may seem mundane, yet they were crucial for survival, determining when to harvest crops, secure livestock, or relocate goods. Buildings themselves reflected these practical concerns. Timber frame houses were raised on short stilts or plinths to keep floors above typical flood levels. Ground floors often served as storage areas for goods less sensitive to moisture, while living quarters were placed 1 or 2 stories higher. Streets were narrow, muddy, and uneven, designed not for elegance but for functionality in an environment that could be transformed by rain, tides, or tidal surges. The city's sanitation was rudimentary. Waste often flowed directly into the Thames, which provided both resource and hazard. Residents learned to navigate these conditions with experience, patience, and careful attention to patterns that outsiders might consider trivial. Flooding was a slow, recurring challenge. Seasonal rains, combined with high tides, often caused the river to overtop its banks, inundating streets and houses. The water might rise gradually, allowing residents to move belongings, reinforce doors, or construct temporary barriers. Yet there were times when sudden storms or unexpected tidal surges turned familiar streets into channels of flowing water. The response was never dramatic, at least in the way a storybook might portray it. Rather, it consisted of measured adjustments, communication among neighbors, and the steady application of local knowledge. Every household, every merchant, every fisher learned to observe, predict, and respond. Economic life adapted around these risks. Grain stored for trade was elevated, or kept in waterproof containers. Market schedules were flexible, taking into account weather and river conditions. Ships waiting at the docks could be delayed for days, requiring careful coordination among traders, sailors, and port authorities. The rhythm of commerce depended on a subtle understanding of water patterns and seasonal variations. A miscalculation could result in lost goods, ruined harvests, or disrupted trade networks, making the management of ordinary details a vital form of resilience. Occupational specialization emerged in response to these challenges. Skilled carpenters built stronger jetties and reinforced house foundations. Laborers dug ditches, built rudimentary levees, and maintained canals that diverted overflow. Fishermen adapted their nets and boats to fluctuating water levels, ensuring that they could still provide sustenance to the city. Even the city watch and local authorities developed informal flood protocols, marking high water points, maintaining bridges, and coordinating emergency measures. These routines were not celebrated in chronicles or memorialized in monuments, yet they represented a form of knowledge accumulation that allowed London to persist in a risky environment. Social life, too, was shaped by the river's temperament. Streets that could be crossed easily in summer became impassable in winter. Communities adapted by creating elevated walkways, shifting gathering points, and timing travel to the tides. Children learned early how to navigate slippery banks and muddy streets, a practical education that combined observation, caution, and ingenuity. In a city where flooding was regular, the ordinary acts of daily survival, carrying goods, moving livestock, or transporting water, required foresight and experience, teaching lessons that were passed quietly from generation to generation. Religious practices often intersected with these routines. Churches, built on higher ground whenever possible, served as both spiritual centers and practical refuges during floods. Clergy advised on safe travel routes, mediated disputes over shared resources, and organized communal labor for levee repairs. Rituals, feasts, and processions sometimes coincided with seasonal water events, reflecting the integration of environmental awareness into cultural life. These connections illustrate how ordinary people blended practical knowledge with social and spiritual structures, creating systems that allowed communities to endure challenges that might otherwise have been catastrophic. Medical and sanitary practices were shaped by the river as well. Contaminated water was a source of disease, so residents learned to filter, boil, or avoid certain supplies. Even minor injuries could become dangerous if exposed to stagnant or polluted floodwaters. Local healers, often women with knowledge of herbs and poultices, became essential figures, providing care that relied on observation, patience, and trial and error. In a city at the mercy of seasonal flooding, the ordinary work of maintaining health and hygiene became a quiet but critical form of resilience. Over time, the city adapted slowly but imperfectly. The Thames was never fully controlled. Levees could fail, storms could overwhelm defenses, and ordinary errors, misjudging the tide, leaving goods unprotected, could lead to loss. Yet the repeated cycle of observation, adaptation, and response strengthened communities. Ordinary residents became adept at reading subtle environmental cues, predicting danger, and organizing collective efforts. In a sense, the quiet labor of everyday life along the Thames was the real foundation of the city's endurance, more so than any fortress wall or political decree. Even today, the evidence of these practices can be traced in the remnants of medieval foundations, street patterns, and archaeological finds. The city's resilience was built on knowledge accumulated through repetition, observation, and patient adjustment. It was not heroic in the dramatic sense, but it was essential. The residents of medieval London learned to live with uncertainty, transforming ordinary precautions into the scaffolding of survival. And yet, despite careful preparation, floods remained unpredictable. Each season carried the potential for destruction, reminding residents that human systems, no matter how carefully maintained, were never fully in control of nature. This tension between routine and unpredictability, preparation and chance, defines the quiet drama of medieval London, a city built on patience, observation, and the daily labor of ordinary people. As you reflect on life along the Thames, it is worth considering the subtle ways in which ordinary routines preserve communities and shape history. How much of medieval London's survival depended not on kings or armies, but on carpenters, labourers, fishermen, and neighbours, quietly applying accumulated knowledge. And what might the story of human resilience look like, if we focus not on disasters themselves, but on the everyday adaptations that make survival possible? As the decades passed, London's inhabitants became increasingly aware of the subtle patterns that governed the Thames. Flooding was no longer merely a source of occasional panic. It had become a central factor in planning, labour, and survival. Residents recorded, whether consciously or unconsciously, the timing of high tides, the months when rains were heaviest, and the neighbourhoods most susceptible to overflow. This accumulated knowledge formed a quiet foundation for the city's endurance, shaping architecture, infrastructure, and social norms in ways that were largely invisible to outsiders. The city's physical landscape began to adapt incrementally. Wooden houses and shops were gradually built higher, or elevated on platforms that could withstand moderate surges. Streets in flood-prone areas were reinforced with gravel, clay, or cobblestones, improving drainage while minimizing mud. Ditches and small canals were dug to redirect overflow, often by ordinary laborers who understood the flow of water better than any city official. Bridges were repaired and occasionally rebuilt, designed to endure both the weight of traffic and the occasional force of the river. Each of these interventions was unglamorous, slow, and repetitive, but collectively, they allowed life to continue with minimal interruption during ordinary flooding events. The community itself became a critical actor in managing the river's unpredictability. Neighborhoods organized collective labor, with residents volunteering to repair embankments, carry goods to higher ground, or monitor water levels. Communication relied on observation, signals, and shared experience. Even minor warnings were sufficient to mobilize action. Ordinary people were thus the city's first line of defense. Their routines, checking barriers, hauling supplies, and assisting neighbors, were forms of applied knowledge accumulated over generations. These quiet acts of cooperation were as essential to London's survival as any political decree or royal intervention. Markets, too, adapted to the rhythms of water. Merchants who relied on river transport timed deliveries to coincide with predictable tides, while some built storage areas on raised platforms to protect goods from minor flooding. The city's economy, fragile yet persistent, depended on the ability of ordinary people to interpret environmental signals and act in a coordinated manner. A misjudgment could ruin a shipment, disrupt trade, or lead to shortages of food and essential supplies. The cumulative effect of small, careful decisions shaped the stability of the city far more than dramatic events, illustrating how history is often determined by the steady work of ordinary individuals rather than spectacular acts. Occupations developed specialized routines around flood risks. Fishermen learned to tie boats securely, anticipate the timing of strong currents, and repair nets damaged by debris. Carpenters and masons routinely reinforced structures and repaired docks. Laborers dug temporary dikes, filled sandbags, and maintained small levees. Even children and the elderly contributed in small ways, observing water levels, helping carry supplies, or signaling warnings. The quiet integration of knowledge and labor across social roles strengthened the city's resilience, demonstrating how ordinary cooperation could mitigate environmental challenges that might otherwise have been catastrophic. Sanitation and health were deeply affected by the river's fluctuations. Floodwaters carried waste, increased the prevalence of disease, and contaminated drinking supplies. Residents devised simple yet effective methods to cope, collecting water from safer sources, boiling or filtering it, and maintaining hygiene routines adapted to changing conditions. Local healers and apothecaries monitored outbreaks, providing remedies and guidance that, while limited by contemporary understanding, relied on careful observation and experience. In a city where water could both sustain and endanger life, these everyday practices were vital to survival. Religious institutions often served as both spiritual and practical anchors in this environment. Churches built on higher ground provided refuge during floods and functioned as centers of organization for relief efforts. Clergy coordinated labor, offered guidance to the community, and maintained records of high water marks and unusual events. Rituals, processions, and seasonal festivals were sometimes timed with environmental cycles, blending the sacred and practical in a way that reinforced social cohesion. Ordinary life and spiritual life became intertwined, with routine observation and adaptation forming an invisible framework that allowed the city to endure. The city's leadership also relied on information gathered by ordinary people. Reports from laborers, boatmen, and neighborhood watchmen informed decisions about bridge repairs, supply allocation, and emergency response. While official records might have been sparse, the tacit knowledge held by residents was extensive, accumulated through repeated experience and careful attention to patterns. In this sense, the city functioned as a distributed network of observers and actors, each performing routine tasks that collectively maintained the continuity of life in a flood-prone environment. Even with these adaptations, the Thames remained unpredictable. Exceptional floods could overwhelm defenses, damaging buildings, destroying crops, and displacing families. Yet the quiet work of preparation, strengthening foundations, monitoring water, coordinating labor, softened the impact and allowed recovery to occur more quickly. The city's resilience was not absolute, but it was cumulative, built over decades of persistent attention to detail and careful response to environmental pressures. Through this slow, almost invisible process, London demonstrates how ordinary routines shape historical outcomes. Floods that might have destroyed less organized settlements were mitigated by careful planning, observation, and coordination. The city's survival depended not on heroic acts or sudden innovations, but on patient, repetitive labor carried out by ordinary people over generations. This quiet work, lifting goods, repairing levees, observing tides, formed the backbone of urban resilience and allowed life to continue in the shadow of the Thames' unpredictability. And yet, despite all preparation, each new season carried uncertainty. No wall, ditch, or elevated foundation could fully control the river, and every year brought new challenges. The persistence of daily labor, the knowledge accumulated through repetition, and the collaboration of the community were the true bulwarks against disaster. These ordinary, uncelebrated efforts offer a lesson about the hidden forces that shape human history. The survival of a city often rests on small, repetitive, and patient acts rather than dramatic events or conspicuous heroism. As you consider medieval London along the Thames, it is worth asking, how much of a city's endurance is built on these quiet, repetitive acts of observation, adaptation, and cooperation? And what might modern societies learn from a time when survival depended less on advanced technology and more on patient attention to the ordinary rhythms of life and nature? The Thames never ceased to remind Londoners of its presence. Even when the waters lay calm, their history of unpredictability and quiet menace lingered in memory. In the elevated floors of timber houses, in the cobbled streets with their irregular drainage, and in the reinforced wooden jetties along the docks, life in medieval London was shaped less by single catastrophic events, and more by the cumulative awareness of water's potential, a subtle, omnipresent rhythm that governed work, travel, and social organization. The ordinary routines of observation, preparation, and repair became as vital to survival as any military fortification or royal decree. Residents, from merchants to laborers, developed sophisticated yet understated strategies to coexist with the river. Boats were tied securely during high tides, goods were stored on elevated platforms, and temporary barriers were erected in anticipation of seasonal surges. Families coordinated efforts to move livestock or protect food stores, while small networks of neighbors communicated changes in water levels, warning one another of potential hazards. Children learned early to watch for rising waters, adults adapted trade schedules to tides, and elders shared decades of accumulated knowledge. Survival depended on these quiet practices, repeated faithfully over years, forming an invisible architecture that held the city together even in the face of environmental uncertainty. Floods that overwhelmed defenses were, paradoxically, reminders of both human vulnerability and resilience. When streets transformed into rivers and lower floors became submerged, the city's residents did not panic and disperse entirely. Instead, they worked steadily to repair damage, replace lost supplies, and maintain social cohesion. Laborers rebuilt embankments, carpenters reinforced docks, and community networks ensured that food and clean water reached those most in need. Ordinary routines, carried out with diligence and foresight, acted as the scaffolding that allowed the city to endure despite recurring disruptions. Trade and economic life continued in parallel with these environmental challenges. Markets adapted by adjusting schedules, protecting goods from water damage, and relying on elevated storage. Merchants coordinated shipments according to tides and river conditions, while boatmen monitored currents and hazards carefully. Even minor errors could have devastating consequences, yet the repetitive application of learned techniques minimized risk. Over time, the city accumulated not only material infrastructure, but a collective body of practical knowledge, passed down informally among residents. These uncelebrated acts of observation, adaptation, and labor were central to sustaining urban life in an unpredictable environment. Religious and social institutions complemented these practical measures. Churches, positioned on higher ground, offered refuge during floods and served as hubs for organizing repair work and distributing aid. Clergy coordinated volunteer labor, maintained records of high-water events, and provided guidance rooted in both spiritual and practical experience. Rituals, festivals, and seasonal observances were intertwined with environmental rhythms, reinforcing awareness and fostering cooperation. In this way, the city's spiritual and practical life merged, and ordinary routines became embedded within cultural practices that strengthened communal resilience. Health and hygiene were ongoing concerns, particularly when floods contaminated water supplies and spread disease. Residents relied on simple methods to manage these risks, filtering water, boiling it when possible, and avoiding exposure to stagnant or polluted areas. Local healers, often women with practical knowledge of herbs and poultices, became indispensable. Their work was careful, methodical, and largely invisible to official records, yet it was vital in maintaining the population's ability to continue daily life. Ordinary diligence once again proved as essential as any extraordinary intervention. Perhaps most striking is the cumulative impact of these unglamorous practices. Repeated observation, careful preparation, and persistent labor shaped not only immediate survival, but the long-term character of the city. London endured when other settlements in flood-prone regions faltered or disappeared. Its streets, buildings, and social networks bore the imprint of patient adaptation. The extraordinary resilience of the city was built on ordinary acts executed reliably over generations, raising floors, reinforcing jetties, monitoring tides, and organizing communal labor. These small, consistent practices formed the backbone of urban continuity, illustrating how history is often shaped less by dramatic events and more by persistent, ordinary work. The slow rhythm of preparation and adaptation also created lessons for future generations. Residents learned to respect environmental patterns, to anticipate disruption, and to integrate routine labor into daily life as a form of defense. Knowledge passed from elders to children, from laborers to apprentices, produced a quiet, distributed understanding of survival that extended beyond any single household or profession. Ordinary people, through patient repetition and careful attention, became the custodians of the city's enduring structure. Yet the Thames remained unpredictable. Exceptional floods continued to test human ingenuity and endurance. Even with knowledge accumulated over decades, the river could subvert expectations, reminding residents that control over nature was always limited. This uncertainty instilled humility, fostering a culture of vigilance and measured action. The quiet routines, while not infallible, mitigated risk and created a framework within which the city could recover and adapt, turning potential disaster into manageable disruption. As you reflect on medieval London along the Thames, it becomes clear that the city's survival depended less on kings, armies, or monumental constructions, and more on ordinary people performing ordinary tasks with diligence and foresight. The patient observation of tides, the careful reinforcement of buildings, and the coordinated labor of neighbors were as critical as any historical event recorded in chronicles. In these repeated, uncelebrated actions, the city found endurance, stability, and continuity. And so, the story concludes with a quiet lesson. The resilience of societies often emerges from ordinary routines carried out faithfully over time, rather than spectacular heroism or dramatic interventions. The people of medieval London endured because they observed, adapted, and persisted, ordinary acts that collectively shaped extraordinary outcomes. Perhaps the most enduring reminder is that history is often written, not in battles and proclamations, but in the silent, patient work of everyday life, repeated over decades until it becomes the foundation upon which communities endure. If you stroll through the narrow streets of a northern European town in the late medieval period, you would notice a quiet rhythm to daily life, one that often goes unremarked in the grand narratives of kings, battles, and political upheaval. The lives of artisans, the carpenters, weavers, blacksmiths, and potters, were dominated by repetition, attention to detail, and patient labor. Their work formed the backbone of local economies, and yet it was largely invisible to those outside their guilds. Observing them closely reveals a portrait of ordinary resilience, skill, and endurance that shaped communities in profound ways. A typical artisan workshop was a small, crowded space, often attached to the artisan's home. Light came through narrow windows, supplemented by the glow of a fire or simple oil lamps in the winter months. Tools were arranged meticulously. Hammers, chisels, shears, needles, and looms each had their designated place. Dust, shavings, and fragments of raw materials littered the floor, a byproduct of continual activity. The air carried the mixed scents of wood, metal, dye, and occasionally smoke. Every aspect of the workshop reflected the rhythm of labor, the quiet focus that allowed complex tasks to be completed with precision. The day began early, frequently at dawn, to maximize daylight hours. Artisans followed routines honed over years, inspecting materials, preparing tools, and checking the quality of their previous day's work. Carpenters examined planks for knots and grain, blacksmiths reheated iron and monitored the tempering of blades, and weavers sorted threads according to color and thickness. Even seemingly trivial actions, sharpening a knife, arranging shuttles, or selecting the right pigment, were essential, for small errors could compromise both the functionality and the reputation of the finished product. In this world, diligence was survival, and precision was pride. Guilds provided a framework for apprenticeship and mastery, regulating quality, training, and market access. Young apprentices began with the most basic tasks, sweeping floors, tending fires, or organizing materials, slowly learning the subtle techniques of their craft. Over time they progressed to more advanced work, carving intricate details, controlling dye baths, or forging tools of increasing complexity. The apprenticeship system reinforced repetition and observation, ensuring that skills accumulated reliably across generations. The process was slow, sometimes tedious, yet it produced craftsmen capable of producing goods that were both functional and aesthetically enduring. Economic life in the town revolved around these workshops. Artisans produced goods, not merely for their own consumption, but for sale at markets, fairs, and through merchant networks that extended across regions. Transactions required careful measurement, record-keeping, and trust between buyer and seller. Errors could ruin a reputation and jeopardize livelihood. Therefore, the routines of preparation, inspection, and quality control were as vital to economic survival as to the material product itself. The quiet labor of crafting, counting, and trading underpinned the town's broader prosperity. Even within the workshop, artisans faced constant environmental challenges. Winter cold seeped through wooden walls, making metal tools brittle and dyes unpredictable. Summer heat could warp wood or dry out delicate threads. Materials arrived irregularly. Iron shipments might be delayed or dye ingredients spoiled in storage. Responding to these variations required flexibility within the routine, adjusting the timing of tasks, recalibrating techniques, and coordinating with other artisans for shared resources. Survival in this environment depended on careful observation, adaptation, and consistent practice. The social dimension of workshop life was subtle but significant. Craftsmen shared techniques, collaborated on large projects, and advised one another on solutions to common problems. Apprentices learned not only through instruction but by watching and imitating seasoned craftsmen. In this slow, repetitive exchange, knowledge was preserved, refined, and transmitted, forming the invisible architecture of a town's technical competence. Cooperation, patience, and attention to detail created a network of resilience that extended far beyond any single individual. Outside the workshop, townspeople relied on these artisans for everyday necessities: furniture, tools, clothing, and household wares. The reliability of production shaped the rhythms of daily life in ways that were rarely dramatic but deeply significant. Merchants depended on consistent quality for trade. Farmers relied on durable tools, and households required dependable furnishings. Ordinary labor, repeated faithfully, produced the structural underpinnings of civic life, demonstrating how persistent attention to detail can have wide-reaching consequences. Even leisure and spiritual life were intertwined with craft routines. Guilds maintained chapels or sponsored religious observances, reinforcing social cohesion. Celebrations, processions, and fairs provided moments of respite, but they also reinforced networks of labor, commerce, and trust. Observing the repetition of rituals, crafts, and daily labor reveals the continuity of experience that sustained communities. Ordinary routines became the medium through which knowledge, skill, and social cohesion persisted across generations. The daily life of artisans also highlights the relationship between patience and resilience. Each task, whether minor or complex, contributed to a larger system of stability. Carpentry, metalworking, weaving, and pottery required careful repetition. Errors had consequences that extended beyond the individual workshop. The ordinary attention to material, method, and sequence produced not only quality products, but a social and economic infrastructure that allowed towns to endure political instability, market fluctuations, and environmental challenges. In short, routine labor built both material and social resilience. Yet, even with careful practice, uncertainty persisted. Materials could fail, tools could break, and customers might refuse goods for reasons beyond control. The capacity to recover depended on both skill and persistence, qualities cultivated through repetition and the steady accumulation of experience. The ordinary routines of workshop life, often unnoticed in historical records, shaped the trajectory of local economies, culture, and urban survival. In the quiet labor of artisans, history was being written not with dramatic gestures, but with small, repeated acts of precision and care. And so, the story of medieval artisans begins with an ordinary morning in a workshop, a place of routine, observation, and patient labor. Each nail hammered, thread measured, or piece of metal forged contributes to a larger system of survival and social order. In these small, deliberate acts, the foundations of town life, economic stability, and cultural continuity were quietly established. The question that lingers as the day begins is simple but profound. How much of history depends not on kings or armies, but on the patient, repeated efforts of ordinary people working with their hands day after day? As the days and years passed, the workshop became both a home and a school for those who lived and worked within it. Apprentices progressed slowly, their learning marked by repetition, observation, and the patient guidance of masters. A single apprentice might spend months simply sweeping floors, sharpening tools, or mixing pigments, yet each of these small tasks contributed to the development of judgment, attention, and coordination. Mastery was rarely dramatic. It accumulated quietly, piece by piece, day by day, forming a foundation of skill that would sustain both individual livelihoods and the broader economic network of the town. Apprentices observed everything from the angle of a chisel stroke to the consistency of spun thread. They learned to anticipate how materials would behave under different conditions, how wood expanded with moisture, how iron responded to heat, or how dyes changed when mixed with water from a particular well. These lessons, often undocumented, were essential to producing reliable work. A poorly crafted tool or an unevenly dyed cloth could disrupt trade, damage reputation, or create practical difficulties for customers. Success depended on observing patterns, repeating actions with care, and understanding subtle cause and effect relationships, a slow and methodical approach that produced durable skill. Guilds formalized many aspects of these practices. Regulations dictated who could practice which trades, standards of quality, and methods for apprenticeship and assessment. Meetings, inspections, and festivals reinforced these rules, while simultaneously allowing for knowledge exchange and social cohesion. Through guilds, the work of artisans was connected to broader networks of accountability, trade, and learning. The slow accumulation of knowledge in workshops was not isolated. It spread across the town and sometimes across regions as journeymen traveled to learn, teach, and trade their skills. Collaboration among artisans was essential, particularly for large projects such as building a merchant's hall, constructing a bridge, or producing large-scale textiles. Carpenters might work alongside masons to construct a roof. Blacksmiths would supply hinges and locks for carpenters' doors. Weavers would coordinate with dyers to ensure that thread color met specific standards. Each participant relied on the careful, routine labor of the others. These interdependencies required precision, communication, and patience, qualities honed through years of repetitive work. In effect, the ordinary routines of individual artisans became threads in a larger fabric of local economic and social resilience. Economic pressures added another layer of complexity. Markets were unpredictable, raw materials could be delayed or spoiled, and demand fluctuated with season, population growth, or political events. Artisans coped by stockpiling essential supplies, producing durable goods in anticipation of demand, and adjusting techniques to make use of whatever resources were available. A weaver might repurpose slightly damaged thread, a blacksmith might recycle iron scraps, and a carpenter might reinforce cheaper timber. These adaptations required creativity, grounded in routine, transforming ordinary labor into a flexible, problem-solving practice that allowed survival and modest prosperity, even in uncertain conditions. Neighborhoods developed informal knowledge-sharing networks that extended beyond the workshops themselves. Residents would exchange information about reliable suppliers, observe effective techniques, and offer assistance in emergencies. These networks were built slowly, reinforced by repeated interaction and practical experience rather than written instruction. When an unusual problem arose, a shortage of dye, a broken water wheel, or a structural failure, artisans drew upon the collective memory of the community, combining personal skill with shared wisdom. In this way, the ordinary routines of craft labor became embedded within the social fabric, ensuring that knowledge persisted even as individual artisans moved, aged, or died. The workday was punctuated by small rituals that reinforced focus, quality, and social cohesion. Simple breaks for meals, the tending of fires, or the checking of tools were performed with careful attention, and minor ceremonies, such as blessing a new workshop or inaugurating a particularly significant project, provided structure to otherwise repetitive labor. Over time, these small routines reinforced habits, discipline, and reliability. Mastery of craft was as much about cultivating methodical behavior as it was about technical knowledge. Even leisure activities were shaped by these routines. Craft fairs, religious festivals, and seasonal celebrations provided opportunities to demonstrate skill, exchange ideas, and reinforce guild hierarchies. While these events could be lively, they were also structured and predictable, reflecting the broader rhythm of work and life. In every aspect of the artisan's world, repetition, observation, and careful attention to detail shaped outcomes, ensuring the continuity of both skill and social order. Despite their structured environment, artisans faced uncertainty. Raw materials could be scarce. Disasters, fires, storms, or floods could strike unexpectedly, and political changes could disrupt markets. Yet the accumulation of small, deliberate practices provided resilience. Maintaining precise records, crafting tools and goods with care, and cultivating social networks allowed communities to absorb shocks. The repeated, quiet labor of daily life was itself a form of preparation, creating a buffer against disruption and demonstrating that ordinary routines can have extraordinary consequences over time. Through the slow, methodical processes of apprenticeship, collaboration, and adaptation, the artisans of medieval towns became silent architects of resilience. Their work shaped not only material production, but also social cohesion, economic stability, and the survival of communities through uncertain times. Ordinary labor, when repeated with care and observation, produced extraordinary results, connecting generations, neighborhoods, and markets in subtle yet durable ways. And so, the quiet rhythm of the medieval workshop teaches a profound lesson. Mastery, resilience, and historical influence are often cultivated through repetition, patience, and ordinary labor, rather than dramatic gestures or public acclaim. How might the towns of Northern Europe have fared without these countless hours of careful, uncelebrated work? In the next section, we will witness the culmination of these efforts, exploring how artisans shaped entire towns and influenced broader patterns of economic and social life. As apprentices became journeymen, and journeymen eventually masters, the cumulative work of the workshop began to manifest beyond individual skills. Buildings rose with sturdier foundations, furniture became more reliable, tools lasted longer, and textiles retained color and form for years. The quiet, repetitive labor of countless hands produced a visible and lasting effect on the physical and social landscape of towns. Each carved beam, forged hinge, and woven cloth reflected not only skill, but a deeper continuity, the transmission of knowledge across time and generations. These ordinary acts, repeated over decades, formed the foundation of resilience in a society that faced environmental, economic, and political uncertainty. The influence of artisans extended into civic life. Towns relied on their skills for infrastructure, bridges, gates, walls, and marketplaces. The quality and durability of these constructions depended on the meticulous routines cultivated within workshops, careful measurement, selection of materials, and methodical execution. Even minor errors could compromise structural integrity, so repeated attention to detail became the rule rather than the exception. In this way, ordinary labor was transformed into a form of civic stewardship, quietly maintaining the physical and functional framework upon which urban life depended. Trade networks amplified the impact of these practices. Artisans supplied goods to markets not only within their own towns but also in distant cities. Journeymen traveled to expand skills and spread techniques, introducing innovations and reinforcing standards across regions. A blacksmith's methods in one town could influence practices hundreds of miles away. A dyer's careful blending of pigments could set local expectations for color quality. These exchanges, grounded in routine observation and repetition, created an invisible web of knowledge that transcended individual workshops, shaping the economic and cultural continuity of broader regions. The social dimension of craftsmanship remained equally significant. Guilds fostered cooperation, oversight, and mentorship, ensuring that labor was coordinated, knowledge preserved, and disputes managed. Through these organizations, artisans could collectively regulate quality, maintain ethical standards, and provide mutual support in times of difficulty. The repetition of guild meetings, inspections, and apprenticeship rituals reinforced norms and produced cohesion that extended beyond the workshop into the town itself. Ordinary labor, disciplined and repeated, became the connective tissue binding communities together. Artisans also influenced daily life in subtle ways. The reliability of tools, furniture, clothing, and household items shaped household routines, trade practices, and urban organization. A carpenter's precise measurement enabled more efficient construction, a weaver's durable cloth reduced waste, a blacksmith's strong hinge improved security. These seemingly mundane contributions had far-reaching consequences. They allowed towns to function smoothly, commerce to proceed without disruption, and communities to endure hardships. The cumulative impact of repeated careful work was extraordinary precisely because it went largely unnoticed by those outside the artisan networks. Even disasters, when they struck, were mitigated by the quiet diligence of skilled labor. Fires, floods, or storms could damage buildings and disrupt production, but towns with experienced artisans recovered more quickly. Knowledge of repair techniques, reinforced foundations, and material handling allowed reconstruction to proceed efficiently. Apprentices trained in preventive care, maintaining tools, inspecting structures, and managing storage enabled towns to absorb shocks without collapse. The ordinary routines of observation and repair became instruments of resilience, illustrating how persistent small-scale labor sustains societies over time. The daily rhythms of the workshop, repetition, precision, and observation, also fostered innovation. Master craftsmen experimented cautiously within familiar patterns, testing new tools, materials, and techniques. These small experiments, often unnoticed outside the workshop, gradually accumulated into significant improvements, demonstrating that innovation often arises from the patient application of routine labor rather than sudden inspiration. Over generations, these incremental adjustments transformed production methods, building quality, and material culture, shaping towns in ways that are invisible in chronicles, yet central to historical continuity. The story of medieval artisans is ultimately one of quiet endurance. Ordinary men and women, through repeated attention to detail and disciplined work, created the infrastructure, tools, and knowledge networks that allowed towns to thrive amid uncertainty. Their labor, while uncelebrated, produced long-lasting effects: durable buildings, reliable goods, cohesive communities, and resilient economies. In short, the ordinary efforts of artisans laid the groundwork for extraordinary outcomes, providing a foundation upon which urban life could endure and expand. As we reflect on the lives of these craftsmen, it becomes evident that history is not solely shaped by dramatic battles or royal decrees. Instead, it often depends on patient, repetitive, and careful labor, quietly accumulating knowledge, skill, and resilience over time. The workshops of medieval Europe reveal that ordinary routines can leave an extraordinary imprint, sustaining communities, shaping economies, and influencing the trajectory of society for generations. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: behind every city, trade route, or cultural tradition lies the subtle work of countless individuals performing ordinary tasks with extraordinary persistence. Imagine a medieval monastery, nestled in a quiet valley or atop a gentle hill, where the rhythm of life is governed less by markets or politics than by the measured cycles of prayer, labor, and study. For the monks and nuns who inhabited these spaces, survival and purpose were entwined with routine, repetition, and the careful attention to detail that structured their days. Unlike the turbulent streets of towns or the unpredictable campaigns of armies, the monastery operated on an internal order, a slow and deliberate framework that shaped both individual lives and broader society. The day began well before dawn. When the first bells called the occupants from their Spartan cells, silence was observed as a form of discipline and reflection, allowing individuals to center themselves before the day's labor. Morning prayers punctuated the early hours, repeated with precision across generations, cultivating mindfulness, spiritual awareness, and collective cohesion. Every gesture, folding hands, bowing, kneeling, was carried out with deliberation, embedding both ritual and habit into daily life. For those who entered the monastery, these routines became the scaffold of existence, governing time, behavior, and thought. Work in the monastery was as varied as it was essential. Monks and nuns maintained gardens, cultivated crops, tended animals, and repaired buildings. Kitchens, breweries, and workshops required constant attention to support both subsistence and local commerce. Each task demanded skill, patience, and observation, A mismanaged herb garden could compromise medicines. An uneven loaf of bread could disrupt supplies. A leaky roof could threaten living quarters. Repetition was crucial. Ordinary acts performed daily: watering plants, feeding livestock, kneading dough, sustained life, and preserved the delicate balance of self-sufficiency that monasteries depended upon. A significant aspect of monastic labor involved the copying and preservation of manuscripts. Scribes worked in scriptoriums, meticulously reproducing texts with quills and ink on parchment. Letters were formed with exacting care. Abbreviations, line spacing, and punctuation followed precise conventions. Mistakes were corrected patiently, sometimes requiring scraping the ink and beginning anew. This work demanded concentration and discipline, and though it appeared tedious, it safeguarded knowledge, religious, philosophical, and scientific, that would endure for centuries. Through this repetitive labor, monasteries became silent stewards of culture and literacy, ensuring that ideas could survive beyond the fragility of their immediate environment. Education within monasteries extended to novices, who learned both spiritual doctrine and practical skills. Instruction was incremental, first observing masters, then imitating, then practicing independently under careful supervision. Young monks absorbed knowledge of agricultural practices, bookbinding, brewing, and ritual, each skill taught with patient repetition. Through daily exercises, novices internalized both technique and discipline, forming habits that would allow them to contribute effectively to the community's survival and continuity. The cultivation of patience, attention, and consistency was as important as the acquisition of technical knowledge. Monasteries were also deeply integrated into their surrounding communities. They provided charity, medical care, and hospitality to travelers, distributing surplus food, tending the sick, and offering lodging to pilgrims. The labor of preparing meals, maintaining guest quarters, and organizing assistance required careful planning and repetition. Even small errors could disrupt these services or waste resources, so diligence was paramount. Through these ordinary acts, monasteries became pillars of social stability, extending the impact of their quiet routines well beyond the stone walls of their cloisters. Economic activity was carefully managed, even within the ostensibly spiritual setting. Lands owned by monasteries produced crops, timber, and livestock that supported both the order and its charitable activities. Detailed records were maintained of harvest yields, expenditures, and obligations owed by tenants. The repetitive work of accounting, record-keeping, and material management allowed monasteries to maintain solvency, allocate resources efficiently, and plan for the inevitable fluctuations of climate, labor, and political demand. Ordinary routines thus became instruments of survival, transforming spiritual dedication into practical governance. Health and sanitation were ongoing concerns. Monastic life demanded attention to diet, water supply, and hygiene, both to maintain individual well-being and to prevent outbreaks that could devastate the community. Baths, clean clothing, and regular maintenance of water sources were part of daily routine, executed with careful attention to detail. The slow accumulation of best practices over generations ensured that monasteries could endure environmental challenges that might otherwise have threatened survival. Here again, ordinary labor performed patiently and consistently became a foundation of resilience. Even leisure, though limited, followed careful structure. Monks and nuns engaged in contemplation, reading, and quiet conversation, activities that reinforced both mental discipline and social cohesion. Music, chanting, and calligraphy provided subtle variation in the day's rhythm, but always within the framework of the established schedule. Life in a monastery was neither idle nor spontaneous. It was governed by repetitive practices that cultivated endurance, skill, and stability. The quiet power of monasteries lay in this repetition, the patient attention to ordinary tasks that accumulated into extraordinary continuity. Stone walls, gardens, workshops, and scriptoriums were shaped not by dramatic acts, but by daily labor, observation, and discipline. The monks and nuns who inhabited these spaces were stewards not only of spiritual practice, but of knowledge, material culture, and social order. Their quiet routines ensured that, even in turbulent times, the rhythm of daily life could continue with minimal disruption. As you consider the life within these stone walls, it is worth reflecting on the cumulative impact of ordinary routines. How much of medieval society, literacy, and culture depended on patient repetition and careful attention, rather than conquest or political maneuvering? The answer lies in the quiet persistence of monastic labor, shaping generations through acts that may have seemed mundane at the moment, yet became the invisible scaffolding of history. By mid-morning, the monastery's cloisters were alive with the subtle movements of labor and learning. Though the day had begun in silence and contemplation, it now unfolded into carefully sequenced routines, tending gardens, copying manuscripts, maintaining buildings, and preparing meals for both residents and visitors. Each activity was embedded within a rhythm that prioritized patience, repetition, and attention to detail, creating a quiet order that allowed the monastery to function efficiently, even in periods of scarcity or external threat. Gardening and agriculture were central to monastic self-sufficiency. Monks and nuns cultivated vegetables, grains, and herbs in precisely arranged plots, employing crop rotation to preserve soil fertility. Irrigation channels, levees, and drainage ditches required regular maintenance, often through repetitive, labor-intensive work. Mistakes could compromise the harvest, threaten food security, or reduce the effectiveness of medicinal plants. The meticulous nature of this labor reinforced the broader philosophy of observation and careful planning. Success depended on consistency, knowledge accumulated over years, and adherence to established routines. Work in the scriptorium continued alongside agricultural duties, with scribes meticulously reproducing religious, philosophical, and scientific texts. Each letter was formed deliberately. Spacing, alignment, and ink consistency were monitored continuously. Pages were reviewed, corrected, and sometimes scraped clean to ensure accuracy. This slow, repetitive labor preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to fire, decay, or neglect. The monastery became a repository not only of spiritual teachings, but also of practical knowledge, agriculture, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy, ensuring that the painstaking efforts of generations could endure. In addition to craft and scholarship, maintenance of the monastery itself demanded ongoing attention. Roofs, walls, and floors required constant repair. Fires had to be tended and hearths cleaned. Water systems and wells needed inspection. Each minor task was repeated regularly, forming a rhythm that kept the monastery habitable and functional. In a period when external assistance was limited and professional contractors were rare, these ordinary routines ensured that life could continue uninterrupted, even through harsh winters, floods, or shortages of materials. The monastery also functioned as a center of learning for novices and visitors. Instruction was incremental and patient. Novices first observed masters performing a task, then imitated under supervision, and gradually took on responsibility for complex work. This careful training ensured that knowledge, skill, and discipline were preserved across generations. Teaching itself became a form of labor, demanding repetition, attention to detail, and an understanding of human limitations. In this way, the quiet rhythm of daily life extended beyond the monastery walls, influencing surrounding communities by providing skilled individuals capable of contributing to agriculture, craft, and administration. Charity and hospitality were deeply embedded in the monastic routine. Guests, pilgrims, and the needy relied on the order for sustenance, shelter, and care. Preparing food, allocating resources, and coordinating labor required careful planning, repetitive execution, and efficient communication. A poorly timed or mismanaged meal could have far-reaching consequences, while consistent routines ensured that aid was delivered reliably. Through these ordinary acts of service, monasteries became pillars of local stability, fostering trust and social cohesion in ways that were largely invisible, yet profoundly influential. Economic management further extended the monastery's reach. Detailed records tracked land holdings, donations, production yields, and expenses. Each entry reflected careful observation and consistency, forming a foundation for long-term planning. Administrators relied on accumulated data, cross-checked with ongoing labor in fields and workshops, to ensure the monastery could meet obligations, maintain infrastructure, and support charitable activities. Here again, repeated routines, measuring, recording, evaluating, translated ordinary labor into resilience and stability. Health, hygiene, and safety were maintained through structured practices integrated into daily schedules. Residents adhered to strict routines for bathing, cleaning, and waste management. These precautions, though seemingly mundane, reduced disease and preserved labor capacity, reinforcing the monastery's ability to function continuously. Even in a period of limited medical understanding, the repetitive attention to hygiene demonstrated a practical awareness of environmental and bodily risk, illustrating how ordinary routines can sustain community well-being over time. The cumulative effect of these routines extended far beyond the monastery. Local populations benefited from improved agricultural techniques, access to skilled craftsmen, and the preservation of knowledge. Monasteries served as hubs where labor, observation, and skill were systematized, forming a foundation for social, economic, and cultural continuity. Ordinary actions, watering a garden, copying a page, or repairing a roof, were multiplied across decades and generations, creating enduring impact that survived far longer than individual lifespans. Yet despite these careful routines, uncertainty remained. Poor harvests, illness, political upheaval, or environmental disasters could disrupt daily life. The monastery's endurance relied not on luck, but on the disciplined application of knowledge and routine labor accumulated over generations. In the quiet repetition of prayer, work, and study, the monastic community prepared itself to absorb and recover from disturbances, demonstrating how persistence and patience form the backbone of resilience. The story of medieval monastic life teaches a subtle lesson. Historical continuity often depends on ordinary acts performed faithfully over time, rather than on dramatic interventions or conspicuous heroism. The quiet rhythms of labor, learning, and care, repeated day after day, produced extraordinary effects. Monasteries preserved knowledge, stabilized communities, and cultivated resilience, achievements built in the silent repetition of everyday tasks. By the late afternoon, the monastery was a quiet hive of activity, each movement deliberate, each task measured, and each action contributing to a rhythm honed over decades, if not centuries. The cumulative effect of these routines extended far beyond the stone walls, shaping the intellectual, economic, and social landscape of the surrounding region. The daily repetition of prayer, labor, and study formed a lattice of endurance, allowing the monastery to weather environmental fluctuations, political changes, and social challenges, with a consistency unmatched by less disciplined communities. Monks and nuns became custodians of knowledge and culture. Their painstaking transcription of manuscripts preserved religious texts, classical literature, and early scientific observations that might have otherwise been lost to time. Each letter carefully inked, each page meticulously aligned, represented both an act of devotion and a practical strategy to maintain continuity. Through patient repetition, these small acts safeguarded the intellectual heritage of Europe, allowing subsequent generations to build upon centuries of accumulated wisdom. The quiet labor of monasteries ensured that knowledge was not ephemeral but durable, transmitted across centuries and geographies. Material culture was also shaped by monastic labor. Buildings, gardens, water systems, and workshops reflected the care and foresight of routine maintenance and repair. Roofs were replaced systematically, walls reinforced, and fields tended seasonally to preserve fertility. Even seemingly minor tasks, polishing metal fittings, maintaining tools, or mending garments, contributed to the survival and efficiency of the community. These repeated actions created a self-sustaining system, where ordinary diligence became the mechanism through which resilience was achieved. The economic influence of monasteries extended to local populations. By producing surplus food, crafts, and medicinal goods, monasteries became central to trade and the provision of services. Skilled laborers trained within the monastery could disseminate knowledge, techniques, and disciplined work habits throughout the surrounding towns and villages. The effects were subtle, invisible in dramatic chronicles, yet profound in stabilizing local economies and fostering practical skills. Ordinary, patient labor served as the foundation of a wider social network, linking monastic routines to the endurance of communities beyond the cloisters. Social cohesion was reinforced through ritual and routine. Daily prayers, shared meals, and collaborative labor cultivated a sense of order and predictability. These structures allowed the community to coordinate responses to challenges, whether repairing a damaged roof, tending to a sick monk, or distributing food during lean seasons. The repeated rhythms of monastic life, though mundane on the surface, produced extraordinary reliability and stability. In this sense, the monastery functioned as both a spiritual and practical institution, shaping human behavior and sustaining collective effort. Education and mentorship were central to the preservation of these practices. Novices learned incrementally, observing masters, practicing under supervision, and gradually assuming responsibility. Each generation internalized routines and methods, ensuring that knowledge was preserved and adapted over time. The continuity of skill and discipline created a long-term repository of expertise that could respond to both routine and unexpected challenges. In an era without modern institutions, these quiet structures ensured that social, economic, and intellectual life endured with remarkable stability. Despite this careful attention, uncertainty remained ever present. Illness, fire, political unrest, and environmental variation could disrupt the meticulous routines that sustained monastic life. Yet the disciplined repetition of daily practices created buffers against disruption. Knowledge, skill, and social cohesion accumulated slowly over decades, allowed monasteries to recover, adapt, and continue their mission. Ordinary labor, repeated faithfully, became a mechanism for resilience, allowing human ingenuity to persist even in challenging circumstances. Ultimately, the story of medieval monasteries illustrates the extraordinary power of ordinary routines. The preservation of knowledge, the maintenance of physical infrastructure, the cultivation of self-sufficient economies, and the reinforcement of social cohesion were all the result of repeated, disciplined, and patient acts. These institutions endured not because of dramatic events, but because generations of individuals faithfully executed small, uncelebrated tasks that compounded into lasting impact. The quiet work of observation, adaptation, and persistence became the invisible scaffolding of society. As you reflect on the lives within these stone walls, it becomes clear that history is shaped as much by ordinary repetition as by heroic intervention. Monasteries survived and influenced the wider world, not through dramatic moments, but through patient, structured, and deliberate labor repeated across generations. Perhaps the enduring lesson is that resilience, both individual and societal, is built upon the silent repetition of ordinary acts, patiently carried out until they become the foundation upon which human communities endure. Step into a modest medieval town, and you might notice the faint, earthy scents of herbs, dried roots, and unguents lingering in small shops or attached to the walls of modest houses. These were the spaces of healers, apothecaries, and local medical practitioners, whose work was neither spectacular nor highly celebrated, yet whose daily labor quietly shaped the health and survival of their communities. Unlike knights in shining armor or rulers issuing decrees, these practitioners relied on careful observation, patient repetition, and a growing understanding of natural remedies to sustain life, often under precarious conditions. Medical practice in this period was grounded in a combination of inherited knowledge, local experience, and religious influence. Healers relied on texts such as Galen's humoral theories, herbal manuals, and handwritten notes passed down through generations. At the same time, they observed the results of treatments in their patients, adjusting dosages, combinations, and techniques according to subtle signs of success or failure. Each patient, symptom, and outcome contributed to a growing body of practical knowledge, painstakingly recorded or memorized. Even minor details, such as the timing of a poultice application or the precise grinding of an herb, were essential, demonstrating that survival often depended on patient attention to small, consistent actions. Apothecaries' shops were organized with deliberate care. Shelves lined with jars, powders, and dried plants reflected both inventory and observation, each item carefully labeled, measured, and stored. Routine was essential. Ingredients had to be cleaned, weighed, and prepared methodically, often following strict procedures to avoid contamination or degradation. A miscalculation could reduce efficacy or even endanger life. Daily practice emphasized consistency, repetition, and meticulous attention to detail, forming a subtle backbone for medical reliability within the community. Infirmaries and small hospitals operated similarly, emphasizing routine as a tool of both care and observation. Patients were monitored regularly. Temperature, pulse, appetite, and visible symptoms were recorded, often through memory or simple marks in ledgers. Treatment schedules included diet adjustments, herbal remedies, bloodletting, poultices, and the careful application of ointments. The efficacy of each intervention was often uncertain, but systematic repetition allowed practitioners to detect patterns, refine techniques, and gradually improve outcomes. In a world without modern medicine, this patient, careful observation was a form of scientific inquiry, grounded in daily practice. The work of midwives, too, illustrates the importance of repetitive expertise. Childbirth was hazardous, and success often depended on the midwife's accumulated experience and knowledge of anatomy, timing, and local remedies. Repetition, repeated techniques, careful monitoring, and stepwise interventions reduced risk and increased survival, even if outcomes were never guaranteed. The quiet diligence of these practitioners shaped both families and communities, producing incremental improvements in health that were often invisible in historical records, but vital in everyday life. Apprenticeships and informal education reinforced this careful labor. Young healers observed elders closely, gradually assuming responsibility for preparing remedies, attending patients, or documenting cases. Over time, the apprentice absorbed the tacit knowledge embedded in repetition, observation, and incremental adjustment. This slow accumulation of skill ensured continuity, allowing local medical knowledge to persist across generations. Each act, however small, contributed to a network of practice that sustained lives in a period of significant mortality and risk. The social role of healers extended beyond treatment. They advised households on hygiene, diet, and preventative practices. They dispensed herbal remedies to alleviate minor ailments, and they mediated between superstition, religion, and practical care. This quiet integration of routine into daily life meant that ordinary practices, boiling water, applying herbal ointments, or adhering to diet regimens, could prevent illness and improve outcomes. Their work demonstrates that survival in medieval towns relied heavily on careful, repeated attention to ordinary tasks, often far from the dramatic or heroic actions chronicled in history books. Even within the constraints of limited knowledge, trial and error-guided improvement, observing the effectiveness of a treatment, noting exceptions, and experimenting within safe boundaries created incremental advancements in care. Healing became a craft as much as a science, built on patience, memory, and attention to detail. The repetitive, ordinary acts of grinding herbs, monitoring patients, and preparing poultices accumulated over time, gradually producing a body of reliable, if imperfect, medical practice. Consider the broader context. Disease, poor sanitation, and injuries were constant threats, yet communities persisted. The quiet diligence of apothecaries, midwives, and infirmary workers provided a thin but critical layer of protection. Without these repetitive routines, mortality would have been far higher. Survival depended as much on everyday care as on seasonal abundance or political stability. The ordinary labor of medical practitioners, quietly embedded within the rhythms of daily life, formed a foundation for community resilience, extending far beyond individual patients to influence broader social continuity. And yet, despite the structure and care, uncertainty remained inherent to this world. Remedies might fail, infections could spread, and outcomes were never guaranteed. Each day brought small victories and setbacks, demanding constant vigilance, patience, and adjustment. The quiet work of healers exemplifies the human capacity to persist and adapt, producing incremental improvements in survival through ordinary, repeated actions that accumulated into lasting impact. As you imagine the daily routines of these medical practitioners, the grinding of herbs, the careful observation of symptoms, the patient repetition of treatments, it becomes clear that the history of survival is often written in ordinary acts rather than dramatic events. How much of medieval society's endurance depended on the quiet, consistent work of these practitioners, unnoticed by chroniclers, but essential to daily life? The answer lies in the invisible labor that sustained health, built resilience, and quietly shaped the trajectory of communities across generations. As the morning labor of apothecaries and midwives progressed, the emphasis on observation became central to the practice of medieval medicine. Each patient presented a unique combination of symptoms, and practitioners were trained to notice subtle differences, changes in skin tone, pulse strength, breathing patterns, and appetite. These details, though seemingly minor, were critical for diagnosing ailments and adjusting treatments. Observation was not a single act, but a repetitive, disciplined routine, recording conditions, comparing outcomes, and refining methods based on experience. In the absence of modern diagnostics, the reliability of these repeated practices formed the foundation of effective care. Record-keeping, while modest, played a crucial role. Apothecaries maintained ledgers of ingredients, prescriptions, and patient responses. Midwives sometimes noted complications, timings, and recovery patterns. Although much of this documentation has been lost or survives only in fragmentary manuscripts, it reflects a culture of meticulous attention. The repetitive act of documenting and reviewing observations allowed practitioners to accumulate practical knowledge, transforming ordinary labor into a form of empirical inquiry. Over years and decades, this incremental accumulation became an invisible library of medical insight that strengthened communal health. The preparation of remedies was similarly structured. Herbs, roots, and minerals had to be cleaned, measured, and combined according to established methods. The repetitive nature of these tasks ensured consistency in potency and minimized error. Apothecaries refined their techniques through constant practice, grinding, mixing, and compounding materials in precisely measured doses. Even small deviations could diminish effectiveness or risk patient safety. Each repetition, each careful measurement, contributed to the reliability of the medicine, demonstrating that ordinary diligence could produce results with lasting impact. Community engagement further amplified the effects of these routines. Practitioners advised families on hygiene, diet, and preventative measures. For instance, instructions on boiling water, storing food carefully, or cleaning wounds with vinegar were passed along methodically. These routines, repeated consistently, reduced the incidence of disease and helped communities weather epidemics. Ordinary care, multiplied across households and neighborhoods, became a network of subtle protection, illustrating how mundane practices could produce remarkable resilience. Training apprentices and assistants was another central task. Young practitioners observed, imitated, and gradually assumed responsibility for preparation, treatment, and observation. This incremental learning depended on repetition. Repeated instruction, repeated practice, repeated correction. Over time, novices internalized both technique and discipline, ensuring continuity of knowledge. The slow transmission of skills across generations illustrates how ordinary labor sustains expertise and social resilience, even without formal institutions or widespread literacy. Challenges were constant. Materials could spoil, symptoms could be ambiguous, and external factors, malnutrition, poor sanitation, or war, could undermine treatment. Practitioners mitigated these risks through careful attention to routine, repeated cleaning of tools, consistent preparation of remedies, and methodical patient observation created layers of reliability that allowed care to proceed despite uncertainty. The ordinary acts of daily labor became a quiet form of risk management, a buffer against the unpredictability of medieval life. The collaborative dimension of care was also significant. Apothecaries, midwives, and herbalists often exchanged knowledge, shared observations, and coordinated treatments for complex cases. These networks, built over repeated interactions, strengthened collective understanding. While the work was rarely dramatic, it ensured that communities had access to a distributed body of practical knowledge, enhancing survival and health outcomes. Ordinary routines, when shared and repeated across networks, produced resilience that far exceeded the capacity of any single individual. Even spiritual practices intertwined with medical labor. Prayers, blessings, and ritual gestures were incorporated into treatment, reflecting a worldview in which physical, mental, and spiritual health were interconnected. The repetition of these rituals, alongside the methodical preparation of remedies, reinforced the discipline and focus required for effective practice. Spiritual and practical routines merged, forming a comprehensive system in which ordinary actions carried both symbolic and practical significance. Ultimately, the daily life of medieval practitioners illustrates the extraordinary power of ordinary labor. Grinding herbs, noting symptoms, cleaning instruments, and observing patients may have seemed mundane, yet these repetitive acts sustained health, preserved knowledge, and enhanced community resilience. Over time, incremental improvements and accumulated experience transformed these quiet routines into enduring systems of care. The ordinary work of practitioners ensured that survival was possible, even in an environment fraught with disease, injury, and uncertainty. As you reflect on these routines, one question remains: how much of society's survival and stability depended not on kings, armies, or legislation, but on the persistent, careful, and uncelebrated work of healers and apothecaries? Their quiet labor, repeated over years and across generations, shaped the trajectory of communities and preserved the delicate thread of human continuity. As evening settled over the town, the rhythm of the healer's work drew to a close, leaving behind the subtle but pervasive effects of a day spent in patient labor. The quiet repetition of observation, preparation, and care had not only aided individual patients, but had accumulated into a broader resilience within the community. This resilience, built on ordinary routines repeated over decades, illustrates how survival often depended less on heroic interventions and more on disciplined attention to detail, meticulous practice, and careful observation. The cumulative effect of these practices extended well beyond the apothecary or infirmary. Families who received guidance on diet, hygiene, and the timing of remedies experienced better outcomes, and knowledge passed down through apprentices spread these benefits further. Local epidemics were mitigated, not through miraculous cures, but through the consistent application of routine practices, cleaning wounds carefully, preparing herbal poultices methodically, and observing symptoms diligently. Each act, repeated countless times, created layers of protection that allowed communities to endure adversity, demonstrating the profound impact of ordinary labor. Monastic and urban medical networks amplified this effect. Practitioners shared remedies, observations, and insights, gradually refining their understanding of disease and treatment. Over time, this collaboration produced a body of collective knowledge, resilient enough to survive the movement of individuals, scarcity of resources, or external crises. Repetition, standardization, and careful observation transformed isolated acts of care into enduring systems that supported generations. highlighting the quiet but powerful role of cumulative practice in historical survival. The training of apprentices ensured continuity. By observing, imitating, and gradually assuming responsibility, novices internalized both technique and discipline. Each repeated task, grinding herbs, preparing ointments, monitoring a patient, became part of an inherited skill set, transmitted with precision across decades. The reliability of treatment depended on this disciplined repetition, showing that ordinary labor, carefully transmitted and preserved, had extraordinary consequences for community survival. Environmental awareness was integral to this work. Practitioners adjusted their practices according to the seasons, availability of herbs, and changing patterns of illness. They observed subtle indicators of local health trends and adapted routines to mitigate risk. These adaptations, built on repeated observation and careful attention to detail, were essential in an era without modern sanitation or scientific instruments. Ordinary vigilance became the cornerstone of resilience, demonstrating the profound importance of methodical labor in sustaining human communities. Even within the spiritual framework of medieval life, the repetition of ritual and prayer intersected with practical care. Blessings, protective charms, and devotional observances were intertwined with treatments, reinforcing discipline, attention, and patient focus. While contemporary observers might dismiss these actions as superstition, the repeated rituals fostered a mindset of careful observation, structured procedure, and attentive care, qualities essential to effective practice. In this sense, spiritual routine and medical routine were mutually reinforcing, producing both psychological and practical benefits. The quiet labor of medical practitioners also fostered incremental innovation. Experimentation with combinations of herbs, preparation techniques, or timing of interventions was guided by careful observation and slow adjustment. Each minor improvement, accumulated over years and decades, contributed to a broader evolution of knowledge. While invisible in dramatic chronicles, this patient refinement of practice had profound implications, allowing communities to survive longer, recover faster, and transmit practical wisdom across generations. Ultimately, the story of medieval medical practice illustrates the extraordinary effects of ordinary actions. Life and survival in these communities depended not on dramatic heroism or singular breakthroughs, but on the patient repetition of small, careful acts. Grinding herbs, observing patients, recording outcomes, and mentoring novices. These uncelebrated routines accumulated into systems of knowledge, skill, and resilience that sustained towns and villages through uncertainty, disease, and hardship. As we reflect on the enduring influence of these practitioners, one truth emerges: much of human continuity relies on ordinary, persistent labor rather than spectacle. The quiet dedication of apothecaries, midwives, and infirmary workers formed invisible scaffolds upon which communities survived and thrived. Their work reminds us that history is often written, not in dramatic events, but in the disciplined, patient, and repeated acts that sustain life over generations.